Hello and welcome to episode 24 of the Teacher's Tea Time podcast. My name is Mark and I hope you're doing well. This podcast is about, by and for anyone who has ever had anything to do with schools and education. That's probably almost everybody. Topics and content in this podcast are listener generated. They come from listeners just like yourself. We are proud to be a member of Adjacent, a design collaborative made up of educators who dream of a better world for our students and their teachers. Learn more at adjacent.org. I have a mug of tea ready, so let's sit back, relax, and get on with the show. I was really pleased with how the last episode was received by our regular listeners. When they contacted me, they pointed out how in the early two civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, formal education systems developed to support writing, and this was necessary to allow for the running of these new complex societies. In these places, a knowledge currency emerged, and with that, you got some familiar themes that still resonate today. For example, who gets access to education? What's the purpose of education? And who pays for it? And then you've got questions such as, can a formal education make it easier to move between social classes? Or does it preserve the status quo? And the other thing that came up were these ideas of technological challenges of actually having a formal education system. If you haven't yet listened to episode 23, I recommend you download it and give it a listen before you go ahead and put this one into your ears, just so you can get a sense of the chronology of the story. What I'll do is I'll give you a minute or two to go ahead and do that, and I'll see you back here shortly. Okay, so if you're still with me, then you already listened to episode 23, and I'm just going to assume that you're ready for more history of education. So in this episode, we're going to complete our brief tour of the early civilizations in this Neolithic era and beyond. We're going to begin with a quick discussion of what was happening in the Indus River Valley civilizations, and then we'll travel to ancient China, and then finally we'll take a look at the Meso-American systems, and that should bring us up chronologically to around what we call the classical era, when Greece and Rome were in their prime. So it's argued that the civilizations which developed in the Indus River Valley were even more advanced than those in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. At its height, the Indus-Sarasvati, or the Harappan civilization, based in Harappa, extended for more than 1 million square kilometers from the Arabian Sea to the Ganges. We know that around 7000 BCE there were agricultural settlements there, and by 2500 BCE the area was populated by around 5 million people. On the banks of the Indus, the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro grew. In these cities, streets were planned in a grid system with wide roads. Houses were built from mud bricks and were often raised up to allow for flooding. These cities also had a sewer system and a water supply. So scholars often assume that even the poorest citizens had a better standard of living than in Mesopotamia. But we're not sure, with no real evidence to say so. However, what we do know for certain is that through the second millennium BCE, the area was populated by Aryan groups who settled from the steppes. And that's an area that stretched from modern-day Eastern Europe, the Ukraine, through to the south of Russia, into today's Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Now, don't have them mistaken for these cosplay supremacists who claim that white folks are Aryans. That's something completely different and dangerous. And those connections are rooted in 19th century nationalism and colonial ideas. But the Aryans we're talking about in the Indus River valleys are really important because they wrote down a collection of stories from that area known as the Vedas. These are the oldest known stories told, and they're from as long ago as 7000 BCE. Their writing formed the basis for the literate society that then traded with the other civilizations to its east and to its west, so Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China. Now, while we don't have any evidence of formal places of education as we do is with Egypt or Mesopotamia, we can assume that there were complex institutions that served as places of learning. For example, we know that as a culture they mastered astronomy, time, elementary mathematics, and medicine. Also, their religious law and the Vedas, the writings, needed to be learned and shared. And so in any complex society, there had to be an administration to oversee all of this. And so it's not difficult to make an assumption that there was a formal education system based around learning of the Indus script. The trouble is, we don't really have any hard evidence of what that process looked like. And unfortunately, climate change caused the monsoons and the floods to lessen and change their predictability. And with that change of predictability meant that the way of life in this region had to change too. So by about 6000 BCE, those larger cities became abandoned and smaller villages became the norm. And as a result, we're left with more questions about this fascinating period of human history in a very under-researched geographical area. At the same time as civilizations were beginning along river valleys in Africa, the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, so life began to change in ancient China too. As early civilizations grew along river valleys here, so did writing, and the subsequent need to spread and control who gets access to that knowledge. Early hieroglyph writings emerged in China around 2000 BCE, and professional institutions were created to teach knowledge and writing, akin to what we have seen in the other early civilizations. We know the first schools in ancient China were established during the Jia dynasty, 270 BC to 1600 BCE. And please excuse any poor pronunciation on my part. Doing my best, but I'm not very good at Chinese pronunciations, and I really wish I was better at it. So, to the east of the capital of the Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 21 BCE, we found buildings where the children of the nobility were educated. And to the west, there were buildings where ordinary children could be educated. So we know that there was education for different parts of the social structure. Throughout the region, a state and a local school system was developed. State schools were for children of the nobility, and there were elementary schools, and there were colleges. There were also these things called village schools, also called local schools, which were divided into 4 levels. So it was possible that a poorer student could pass through all 4 levels and get into college. And this implies that education may have provided a pathway for upward mobility, a meritocracy, as you would have it. Now, we don't know who or what paid for education and schooling, but we can assume that it was privately funded. And these schools, they taught writing, they taught mathematics, and they rooted instruction in Confucian philosophy. Now, when Emperor Xinji Huang, the first emperor of a unified state, took over, he abolished the private schools because he wanted a more centralized control of education, and he forbade people to read Confucian classic texts. Indeed, he even gave orders that Confucian books were to be burned, and scholars of Confucianism were to be burned alive. He wanted to establish an education system based on legalist principles. So, without going into too much detail, legalism was a philosophy which sought to organize society using reward and punishment, akin to how modern-day autocracies run. And it was felt important to educate people on how to be compliant citizens in a society, as opposed to how to be participatory citizens who look to improve societies. In this period, state bureaucracies also grew, and rulers increasingly needed educated, thoughtful, and scholarly administrators to run the empire. Thus, the education system was reformed to make people compliant and to provide a number of competent administrators who could make sure that things would run efficiently. It would be another 1,000 years until the development of the civil service examination, but the beginnings of a bureaucracy supported by an education system can be seen growing at this time. Indeed, over the next 800 years, there would be a swing from private schools, which could follow their own philosophy and education method, to state schools which were more centralized and controlling. And this struggle between the compliance of legalism and the more humanistic philosophies of Confucianism, Taoism, and much later Buddhism would continue until the last emperor and the introduction of communism in the 20th century. Meanwhile, in Meso-America, that's this area of Middle and South America, there were similar evolutions of civilizations. For example, by 1000 BCE, the Olmec were established and had developed their own writing system, as had the Maya. We know more about the Mayan civilization in this ancient period. For example, we know they developed an accurate calendar, counting 365 days in a year, and they also maintained a 260-day calendar and a 360-day calendar for use in agriculture to count religious holidays and understanding the present so that we might know the past and predict the future. That's straight from their words. So this civilization also recorded a better understanding of medicine and anatomy than even the Greeks in Europe. All of this knowledge needed to be learned by those who needed to know it. In the case of Mayan civilization, this was the nobility and the leadership. It's a common theme in these societies that as soon as we get a social structure, those in charge realize that knowledge and literacy is an important commodity. This is this idea of a knowledge currency. And therefore, only their own children need to have access to it. Or, if you're back in China, only a select few of normal people just to make sure the bureaucracy can run. This will be different to the later Aztecs and the Incas further south, but as they come later in our historical story, there is more that we need to know before we return to this area of the world. So, with the Neolithic Revolution, we see the emergence of civilizations, and with the emergence of civilizations, we see the emergence of writing, and what we would consider a modern way of doing things, with knowledge and literacy as a key commodity. This leads to issues of power and control of society. This happened in 5 geographical areas at about the same time. In Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, we have clear evidence of schools and schooling. In the Indus River Valley, we know that there were complex cities which needed organizing. We know that there was a need for scribes and scholars, and we know that this all had to be learned. This is similar to Olmec and Mayan civilizations, where we know that writing emerged and complex societies developed. And we know that they developed some important knowledge that needed learning and preserving. But we don't have much evidence of an education system as we know it. And then we have China, where formal education developed along with writing and philosophy. And in China, we see the emergence of a centralized education system, government-controlled, used to control and promote the social classes. And we also see a rival system of private schools and colleges, which furthered their own philosophies and their own curricular aims. It's amazing to me to see how so many themes, things about modern day living that we think we take for granted today, emerge from these 3 early civilizations that we looked at in today's podcast. For example, in the Indus River Valley, we can see how efficient city planning could create a more equitable standard of living. Or, in ancient China, we can see there's a battle between private and state control of schools, with the political agendas of leaders controlling what is taught. We see echoes of this in legislation about what should be included in state standards today, and in the fight for academic freedom to teach students things like critical theory. We also see a similar pattern of education and literacy being the keys to power in early Meso-American civilizations too. It certainly was understood in our early civilizations that education can lead to social mobility. And, if not controlled, social mobility could be dangerous for those who have power. So for me, that's a key theme that resonates all the way through in all discussions about education in a pre, during, and post-pandemic world. When we next look at the history of education, we're going to examine classical Greece and Rome, and we'll see if there are similar things about education in these worlds which resonate in the modern world. Probably find that there really are. But until then, that was episode 24 of the Teacher's Tea Time podcast. This podcast is a proud member of Adjacent, a design collaborative made up of educators who dream of a better world for our students and their teachers. We create, write, talk, teach, and learn about things that matter most in education. To find out more, point your browser to www.adjacent.org. That's www.edjacent.org. For me, it's the stories of teachers, students, and school communities that matter. As such, this podcast is only possible with the help and support of its listeners. Please leave positive reviews wherever you are able. If you're on iTunes or a Spotify subscriber, leaving a good review can really help visibility. Also, don't keep this podcast to yourself. Tell your friends to subscribe and listen too. One thing we all have in common is that we've been to school. So, if you'd like to contribute to the pod in any way, if you have a story to share, long, short, tragic, or comic, if you have comments to make about the podcast, or just want to say hi, you can send an email to teachersteatimepod@gmail.com, or alternatively you can send emails to me directly using mark@adjacent.org. I love to read what you have to say. If social media is your thing, you can follow me on Twitter @markdiakop. You can find our contact information, copies of the show notes, and you can download previous episodes of the podcast at www.teachersteatimepod.com. The podcast artwork was created by Phaedra. Opening and closing music is by Bryan Boyko. It's been my pleasure to be your host today. Thank you for listening.